In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgment, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of these confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and as I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt like I wanted the world to be in uniform and out of sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, and there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that registers earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. Broke my float. Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1917, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now felt like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could sport one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, why yes, with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of '22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went up to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I felt that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down into the young, breath-giving air. About a dozen volumes on banks and credits and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets only Midas, Morgan, and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again the most limited of all people, the well-rounded man. Most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at through a single window after all. It is a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America, as on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. About 20 miles from this city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere. The Great Wet Barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls flying overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their complete dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the, well, less fashionable of the two. Though this is the most bizarre tag for the... This is the most superficial tag for the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house is at the very tip of the Sound. My house is at the very tip of the Egg, 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between 2 huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standards, a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new, under a thin beard of raw ivory, and a marble swimming pool, and over 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore and had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the fashionable palaces... Damn it! Wait. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the real history of the summer begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin, once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The front lawn started at the beach and ran towards the door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines as if from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows glowing now with reflected gold and open to the warm, windy afternoon. Damn it. A line of French windows glowing now with reflected gold and open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan was standing on the porch. Tom Buchanan in riding gear was standing on the porch with his legs apart. He had changed since his New Haven years. He was now a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a hard mouth and rather supercilious manner. 2 shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Even the effeminate swank of his riding boots couldn't hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill... of his riding clothes couldn't hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he straightened the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscles shift when his shoulders moved beneath his thin coat. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. I don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. Just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We talked for a minute on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Oh, I think I fucked up bad. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. I didn't fuck up. Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleamed white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little ways into the house. The curtains, A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other. Twisting them like pale flags, twisting them up towards the ceiling, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling. I want to do it again. A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other, twisting them up like pale flags. Breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other, like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. Their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they'd just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood there for a moment, listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. When Tom Buchanan shut the rear window, there was a boom. There was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window, and the caught wind died out about the room. Oh, shit. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan closed the rear window, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rug and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor as the caught wind died out about the room. Sorry. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She sat completely motionless at her end of the divan, She sat at her end of the divan, extended full length, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised. Indeed, I almost murmured an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. Any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws stunned tribute from me. I think I fucked that up. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came a little forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again as if she'd said something very witty. And she held my hand, looking up into my face for a moment, promising there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. This is a way she had. She whispered in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. Nevertheless, Miss Baker's lips fluttered and she nodded at me almost imperceptibly. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws stunned tribute from me. I looked back to my cousin, who began asking me questions in her low, thrilling voice. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for 2 days on my way east, for a few days on my way east, and how everyone had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. The whole town's desolate. All the cars have their left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How wonderful. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to. Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested a hand on my shoulder. What you doing, Nick? I'm a bond man. With who? I told him. Never heard of him, he said. He answered shortly. Never heard of him, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East. Don't you worry about that, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if alert to something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been sitting on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't blame me. Don't look at me, said Daisy. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No, thank you, said Miss Baker to the tray of 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are. He took down his drink as if it were the drop in the bottom of the glass. How you managed to get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at Miss Baker. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulder like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. I realized now that I'd seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. You live at West Egg, she said contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single... You must know Gatsby. Gatsby, demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could say he was my neighbor, before I could reply he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging a tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly at their sides, the 2 young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at us all radiantly. I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. Do you always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it? We have to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What'll we plan? She looked at me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she said, I hurt it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to do it, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big hulking physical specimen of I hate that word hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker spoke at once, with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter. It was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desires. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from face to face towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed after my second glass of rather corky but impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in a strange way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about everything. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empire by this man Goddard? Why no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't watch out, the white race will be utterly submerged. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow's figured out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously into the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. The idea is we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod. She winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, were no longer enough for him. When almost immediately the telephone rang and the butler left for the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned towards me excitedly. I'd love to see you at... No. Would you like to hear a secret? She whispered. It's about the butler. I'll tell you a secret. It's about the butler's nose. Would you like to hear it? Would you like to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be a silver polisher for a group of people in New York who had a silver polishing service for over 200 people. And he had to polish from morning till night, until it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection. Wait. Until he had to give up his position. The butler came back, murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and went wordlessly into the house. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward to me again, her voice glowing and singing. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? This is untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Oh, damn it. I missed something after the butler. Yeah. It's about the butler's nose. Things went from bad to worse until he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell upon her with romantic affection. Each light... Her voice compelled me breathlessly forward as I listened. Then the glow faded. Each light... damn it. Confused. I'm moving on. As if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw down her napkin, excused herself, and went inside. Miss Baker and I exchanged a glance, consciously devoid of meaning. Uh-oh. Consciously devoid of meaning. A murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur... I had this at one point. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor, I began. Shh, said Miss Baker in a warning tone, a warning voice. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean you don't know? she said, honestly surprised. Honestly surprised? I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why? She began hesitantly. Or she hesitated. Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman, I repeated blankly. Almost before I grasped her meaning, there was the crunch of a leather boot and the flutter of a dress, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. Couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and then continued. I looked outside for a minute. It's very romantic. I looked outdoors for a minute. It's very romantic outdoors. I saw a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over on the canard of the White Star Line, and he's singing away. Her voice sang. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, said Tom, and then to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables. The telephone rang again inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. To a certain temperament... I couldn't have guessed what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, it might have been intriguing. My own instinct was to call immediately for the police. Needless to say, the horses weren't mentioned again. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, walked back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while I, trying to seem pleasantly interested and a little deaf, followed Daisy around a series of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and gradually her eyes moved out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, and so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. We don't know each other very well, Nick, she said. Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war. That's true, she hesitated. Well, I've had a very bad time of things, Nick. And I've gotten to be pretty pessimistic about everything. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited for her to go on. But she didn't, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her little girl. I suppose she talks and eats and everything? Oh yes, she looked at me absently. Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Would you like to hear? Very much. Well, she was less than an hour old and Tom was God knows where, and I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. I turned to the nurse and asked right away if it was a boy or a girl. She said it was a girl, and I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so, all the best people, and I know so. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. Her eyes flashed about defiantly, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. I fucked up. Her eyes flashed about defiantly, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. The moment her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tone. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a raised hand. Oh, I fucked up. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull in the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted off the paper as she turned to the page with a flutter of the slender muscles in her arm. When we entered, she held us silent for a moment with her lifted hand. To be continued, she said, in her very next issue. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee. 8 o'clock, she said, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's playing in the tournament tomorrow, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face had been familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had gazed out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Palm Beach and Hot Springs. I'd read some story of her too, a critical, unpleasant story. But what it was, I had long since forgotten. Good night, she said. Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up. I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, said Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you two together, lock you up in a linen closet, or push you up to sea in a boat by accident, that sort of thing. Good night, said Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. Tom and Daisy looked at each other for a moment in silence, or stood for a moment in silence. Nice girl. Nice girl, said Tom. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to take care of her, aren't you, Nick? Come over often. She's going to be spending a lot of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Tom and Daisy looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I inquired quickly. Louisville, said Daisy. Our white girlhood was spent there together. Our beautiful white... Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? Daisy looked at me. Can't seem to remember. But I think we talked about the Nordic race, yes. It just sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know, don't believe everything you hear, Nick. I assured him that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They followed me to the porch and stood in a cheery square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, Wait! We forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. It's a libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, opening up to me, surprising me by opening up in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Yes, Tom corroborated kindly. We heard it. Of course, I knew what they were referring to. The fact that gossip had published the bonds was one of the reasons I had come out east. You can't stop going out with an old friend because of rumors, and at the same time I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Nevertheless, their interest touched me and made them seem less remotely rich. Their interest touched me and made them seem less remotely rich. Nevertheless, as I drove home, I felt uneasy. It seemed to me the thing to do was for Daisy to run from the house, child in arms, but there was no such intention in her head. As for Tom, The fact that he had some woman in New York was rather less surprising than the fact that he had been depressed by a book. Something was causing him to nibble at the edges of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep into summer on roadhouse roofs and at wayside gas stations, wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. I returned to my estate at West Egg, rolled the car under its shed and sat out for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and the full bellows of the earth blowing the frogs full of life. Okay, you can see that I did not cheat. I was almost there. Leaving a loud, bright night, full bells of the earth. Oh, good. I still got time. A cat, the silhouette of a cat, wavered in the moonlight, and turning my eyes to see it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion, with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely gestures and the sturdy position of his feet upon the ground said that it was Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Mrs. Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I did not call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He thrust his arms out seaward, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was shaking. Involuntarily, I glanced out to the dark water and distinguished nothing, except a small green light that might have been the end of a dock, minute and far away. When I looked for Gatsby once more, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness.